It's the Anfield Wrap on Radio City Talk. Neil Atkinson with you until about 7:30, and in front of me I've got John Gibbons and I've got Gareth Roberts, but I'm really pleased to have Professor Damian Hughes join us. And just to give you a bit of background on what we're going to do with this show, Professor Damian Hughes has worked, I'm not going to call him Professor again, he's worked as an advisor to help create winning cultures in the following sports: international and domestic rugby league, Premier League football, rugby union, we'll overlook that one and let you off, athletics, water polo, swimming. Sorry?
They're winning.
They are winning, but it's still rugby union, mate. Water polo, swimming, diving, boxing, squash, golf, and Australian rules football. I might want specifics on that one. And he's here to talk about his new book, which is called 5 Steps to a Winning Mindset. And we want to talk about him in the context of that winning mindset at Liverpool, football management and coaching in general. But the point of the book is that it's about learning from each of these roles that he's had and also how that can apply to your normal life. So I'm just going to keep talking for another second and then we're all going to let Damian talk. And it goes like this. There's a quote from the introduction of his book and it reads like this: "The role of a sports team leader is fascinating, complex and tough. Fantasy football leagues may convince us it's about buying players and selecting a team. In reality, it's about creating winning environments, recruiting and developing and nurturing talent, effectively communicating a shared vision with a diverse collection of individuals, delivering on enormous expectations from a range of stakeholders, overcoming significant challenges, handling pressure and staying focused throughout." And he does emphasise in there that there's no formula for a winning culture. And you've got this acronym in your new book, which is simplicity, thinking, emotional intelligence, practical, storytelling, which comes to steps. It's convenient. Could have been pest. But it's about, and you can expand further on this, it's massively about communicating ideas and being able to communicate ideas throughout a number of fields that are simultaneously both simple and profound, that people can universally get on board with.
Yeah, that's a better summary than what I could have offered, to be honest. But yeah, you're right. I've spent the last 20 years or so working in elite level sport, and
your background is that your dad's a boxer.
Yeah, my dad was a boxing coach.
Trainer,
yeah. So he was a boxing coach. So I grew up in a boxing gym, effectively, and I watched him work with young kids in sort of from inner city Manchester right the way through to taking lads to winning world titles. So I've been steeped in that sort of environment, and obviously because of my dad, my interest has always been in terms of the coaching. So over the last 20 years or so, I've been working with a lot of elite coaches and just observing them. And my interest is, what do they do that's similar, rather than what makes them special? What do they do that anyone could look at and go, oh, I get that? And that's why I say there's no formula, but I've identified there's 5 things that all elite coaches tend to do, and they're the 5 things that I wanted to capture in the book.
So when you come to sort of deal with this, you're saying it's about finding the things that go, just that you can almost exchange from dressing room to dressing room, corner to corner, gym to gym, the things that patterns that you can see in terms of what works but also in terms of what doesn't. Yeah,
exactly. So I start the book by telling a story when I was in the corner back in 96 with my dad. So I used to go and carry the spit bucket and things like that for him.
All the glamorous stuff.
Yeah, all the big stuff. But just being in the corner in terms of just watching the coaches and working with them. And we were in Milan for the world title fight, the super middleweight title fight with the lad from Runcorn, Robin Reid.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd seen my dad. I'd seen all the preparation he'd done in terms of the hours, like studying his opponent, this lad called Vincenzo Nardiello, who was a champion, and looking at and like the strategy. And the strategy was basically Reid they got him superbly fit, and the idea was just keep moving, don't stand and trade with him. And it was about the 6th round, and I'm watching it thinking, this is going great. And I remember watching my dad thinking, what are you going to say in a minute? Because you've only got a minute to intervene in the corner. And I was thinking, what are you actually going to say here? And I ran through the options in my head. I'm thinking you could either say to him, keep doing what we've done, this is all going to plan. You could say to him, don't get complacent, just watch what you're doing. Or you could sort of tell him to step up the pace. And what he did was, when he got in the corner of the ring and I got close holding the bucket, and he said to him just 5 words. He said, sit down when you punch. And I remember thinking, that's brilliant, because what it meant was, in those 5 words, I knew exactly what it meant, which was stop jabbing and moving, but just plant yourself, put both your feet down and start throwing your punches, which give you the extended power. And he said, just sit down when you punch now. And in the next 2 minutes, and Reid nodded, he understood it. Next 2 minutes, he went and knocked him out. Now, I obviously got the follow-up, so I asked my dad afterwards and said, I thought that was brilliant, the simplicity. What was it you'd seen? And he said, well, I'd seen Nardiello had started to drop his right hand just slightly, just by a fraction, which told me he was starting to get tired. And the idea that he'd started to drop his right hand meant that as soon as Reid threw a jab, he was going to connect, and that's when and he said, it happened a bit quicker than I anticipated. But to be able to condense all of that knowledge at that pressure, to be able to just deliver five words to then get the result you want, is almost just an illustration of what great coaches can do.
That's what I wanted to Sorry, I was going to ask you about that. Do you think it's important that messages get more simple the closer you get to the action? And that's an example of actually in the action and getting kind of even more and more simple. Because I think sometimes with football, and people expect these brilliant team talks just before the game and how it's all kind of laid out for the footballers, but actually I think when we found out what's gone on, and you've seen like the whiteboards in the changing room for the game, it's actually been really simple, and I think people have been, is that it? But obviously what they're doing is scaling it down, so actually on the day it's got more and more simple the closer to the action. Would that be correct?
I think that's 100% right. You'll see the best coaches do that. I mean, I did a bit because I've done a previous book on Alex Ferguson. And one of the things that people always speak about him is, if there's one key phrase, it's just this ability to simplify things. And obviously, when he's gone and Moyes has come in, the contrast was, you speak to anybody around it, they all didn't know what he wanted. He was just overcomplicating things. Yeah. So there's a great story where United played Spurs years ago, and Ferguson...
You can't swear, just let you know in
advance.
No.
Yeah. But they played Tottenham, and I remember Roy Keane telling me this, where he said he sat there and he thought, we all know what Tottenham are like. They're a nice footballing team, but we'll stick with them, and after an hour, we'll sort of overwhelm them physically. He said, and Ferguson walked in the dressing room, and he went, lads, it's Tottenham, and walked out. And that was the sum total of it. And Keane said, everybody in that dressing room knew exactly what he meant. Now, there's a contrast. When Moyes was there, United got beat 4-1 to City in one of his early games, and he called Ferdinand and Vidic into a meeting room. He said, I want to go for a few points with you. And Ferdinand says he could see on his laptop he had 15 different video clips he wanted to show. And he said, and he never got beyond the fifth one, because he was going over into such detail. And Ferdinand says he come out of the room, and him and Vidic said, what did he just want? What was all that about? Because it was that idea that you've got all this knowledge in your head and you want to tell everybody everything. And the great coaches say, actually, I'll tell you what you need to know.
I think there's a bit of confidence in yourself there as well, isn't there? Whereas Ferguson obviously had the confidence to keep it simple, whereas maybe someone like Moyes, who's new, feeling like you have to justify your position and maybe kind of trying to do too much.
Well, they've got a really good... I mean, you're right, it is about confidence. I had a really good example of this from years ago. There's a guy called Jimmy Murphy, who was Matt Busby's assistant for years, and then he was sort of like ostracised from the club. And in his later years, he just used to go around like watching park football and things like that. And I knew his family, the Murphys, and my dad used to get him coming into the gym occasionally to come and watch. And I remember once he was talking to a few of us that told him we was interested in coaches, and he gave us the best example of coaching what I could still recount. He said, I'll tell you what makes a great coach. And he threw a tennis ball to one of the lads I was with. And he caught it and he said, how do you find that? And he went, yeah, it was all right, it was easy. He said, how are you getting if I threw two balls at you? And he went, well, a bit of concentration, but I'll catch them both. He said, good. He said, how will you get on if I threw 3 or 4 or 5? And he went, I'll drop them all. And he went, that's great coaching. He said, great coaches know how many tennis balls you can catch, not how many they can throw.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And it's almost that ability just to be able to say, let's get to the very kernel of this and tell you what you need rather than what I know.
But this is where, it's something which, in John's mentioned there, close to the action, dressing rooms in football matches, half-time's half-time, everyone thinks it's 15 minutes, it's not. It's max 6. You've got lads who might be getting some treatment, and you've also got 11 different people who may well be in different emotional states, they might all have different performance levels, and that's where... I mean, the first thing on this, which I think you make really clear in the book, is the idea that this is where, when I heard you speak, where having cultures in advance is very, very important, that everyone knows, firstly, what behavioural models they should all have whenever they perform. So you ingrain them over a long period of time. But then, you can create those cultures, and you do that on the training ground, but it's then having people be able to respond to 3, 4, 5 words of, this is what I need from you, this is what I need from you, this is what I need from all of you. And that's a remarkably, it sounds like you use simplicity, it sounds like it is simple, but it's a remarkably complex thing that takes a lot of thinking and a lot of discipline to do.
Yeah, definitely. And because there's a famous old letter Churchill wrote to his wife, Clemmy, where he said to her, I'm sorry I wrote you a long letter, I didn't have time to write you a short one. And because it sums up that idea that it takes work to be brief, it takes work to be able to say, what do I want you to understand and know nothing else? And that's why, so simplicity isn't about dumbing down or coming out with like some smart sounding sound bites. This is about being able to summarise all that knowledge you've got in your head to say, you just need to know this.
But isn't it about as well like a sort of culture that you've introduced over a period of time? So for instance, say take Jurgen Klopp for example. He's had since October now with this group of players, so every day he's seeing them, he's communicating with them. So when it comes to the match situation, isn't it there as well that, you know, people talk about how the manager influences in that situation. He can just say, lads, this is like when I said X.
Yeah.
And that's it, because they've talked about it for time and time again on the training pitch. I mean, when I say that as well, this is something that got me about watching England the other night when they go out to the Euros to Iceland. It seemed to me that collectively the heads had gone, like they were doing really basic things wrong. And then when the camera goes over to Hodgson on the sidelines, he looks like a rabbit in the headlights as well. He doesn't look like he's communicating anything. And I thought, well, this is mad, because this is surely where the manager steps in and says, lads, this is what we talked about. You know, even if you just said focus or something, do you know what I mean?
I've always got a suspicion, like whenever I watch sport and you see coaches coaching on the touchline, and you like remember Villa Boas when he used to like crouch down on the touchline, and like I see it sometimes with Mourinho, and I think it's all for effect to me, because I think if you've done your job in the training ground, you shouldn't need to be intervening as frequently as they do. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? But it's almost the idea. I wonder sometimes, are you doing that for the benefit of the cameras and the fans?
I've wondered about
rather than the players, because I've worked with coaches where, like in rugby league, for example, I've worked with coaches where they deliberately don't get involved in the action, so they'll go and sit themselves up in the stand. Yeah. And they can get the key bits of information if they really need to. But ultimately they go, my job's done. If I've done my job properly, all this information's been covered during the week. So during the week when we can actually communicate effectively. So I always watch people like that, like the examples you're offering, and say, well, I'm just suspicious of the intentions of why they're doing it.
But then fans might go, we're getting beaten, he's not doing anything. So it's our fault.
Stage management almost.
I remember Stuart Pearce at City, and people used to like lap it up when he used to sort of like be all passion on the touchline and things like that. And I've worked with players in the Premier League. They don't respect that. They don't want you doing that. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Because
they can't hear you most of the time.
Exactly, they can't hear you. But equally, they're suspicious of your intentions as much as anything else.
OK, this is Radio City Talk. Brilliant to have Damian in, John and Gareth as well. After the break, we'll have a song, and then we'll have something else from Tour Player. But we'll know more about that soon. Back with Damian very, very shortly.
You're listening to the Anfield Wrap, back with Neil shortly. Firstly, though, this week on our subscription podcast, Tour Player, the Unwrapped show returned, delving deeper into a Liverpool topic. This time around, the show looked at the club's purchases over the past 5 years, the good, the bad and the ugly. In this clip, Rob Gutman, Neil Atkinson, Craig Rimmer and Neil Dockin go back to 2011 and Kenny Dalglish. You can decide which of the King's signings from that time was the ugly. I couldn't possibly say. Enjoy it.
The Unwrapped Wrap is back. And I think it's a companion piece to the Gutter Show series we've been recording, boys, throughout the summer. But it's taking a broader, wider view of Liverpool's transfer activity, because already this summer, we're through Liverpool fans expressing themselves on social media, comments in the papers, wherever. It seemed to me, in sort of coming up with the concept for this show, that we're in a sort of, what's the word, Groundhog Day of commentary on Liverpool's signings and transfer activity during the summer. In my notes, I've written, these are the typical shouts, and I don't think I'm doing generalising a disservice and saying these are the typical shouts from our fans broadly about the sort of exasperated shouts, should we say, about the sort of signings we are continuing to make. People will say things like, oh no, not another Premier League signing, or oh no, not another cheap unknown squad player when we need proven quality. They will say, not another Southampton player. They will say, we need a marquee signing, or they'll say, we've got to solve a problem position like left back. Boys, am I being fair? Is that the broad range of criticisms? Neil Docking, let me start with you.
Yeah, I think so. Not another Premier League signing. That's one that makes me smile. I've got a friend who always says, Premier League proven. What a load of rubbish. Premier League proven. He's always furious when we go for, a so-called Premier League stalwart, a Stuart Downing type.
Yeah.
So that's one I recognise. Not another Southampton player.
It's become a fave of recent times.
Yeah, it's odd that's become a cliche, but
it is weird when you stop back and think about it. So maybe they got a point. But okay, the purpose of this is to look at Liverpool. We're going to pick the last 5 years. We're going to systematically look at the type of signings Liverpool have made, look at the category of signing, and see where the successes and failures have been, and try and come to conclusions to whether we're destined to repeat our mistakes forever or stuck in some sort of time warp. I don't know. Let's begin at the beginning then. Let's begin at the beginning of the 5-year process. I'm starting in January 2011. We'll think back to those times 5 years ago. Craig, you were a young lad, you had hopes and dreams, everything was before you. And Roy Hodgson had just left the room. Kenny was in charge. And actually the first signing on this, I think I've listed, I don't know, I'm going to guess, 40 players here, or 30 players in the 5 years, 30 significant signings. The very first one, that kind of distorted the picture for us, didn't it?
Yeah, just a little bit. Obviously referring to Luis Suarez. So certainly if you were to look down at this list we've got in front of us, probably the biggest success overall.
He was all right, wasn't he?
Yeah, he wasn't too bad.
2011 2011 was a mixed bag, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, it was, because obviously at the same time we've signed Andy Carroll, so both kind of marquee signings coming in, I think more or less on the same day, wasn't it? A lot of money spent, but I think it just goes to show that, like, I mean, people talk about spending money. That's obviously one of the cliches we mentioned, but just clear evidence there that spending money is not necessarily a guarantee of success. I think it's much more about signing the right player rather than necessarily just throwing the money around. And the contrast between Andy Carroll and Luis Suarez's Liverpool careers were clear examples of that.
Neil, if we go through Neil Atkinson in this instance.
Call me Docking, I can live with it.
Docking. Yeah. Docking, I like that. Atkinson, Docking. Like we're at school again.
Docking feels as though someone who for a long time is suspected of murder and prime suspect, but is broadly speaking gets away with it in the end. He wasn't guilty, we just all thought he was. Go on, anyway.
Docking, adverb, or something like that. Anyway.
Don't look it up, kids.
Don't look it up, kids. It's one hell of... It's actually not a mixed bag, 2011. It is a mixed bag, because Jordan... Atco... Suarez at the beginning of the list, Henderson at the end of the list, but they bookend an array of catastrophes.
Yeah,
it begs the question, what's a good strike rate?
Well, it does beg that question, and you know, if you go to the Paul Tompkins stuff, the average strike rate's around 40%, so 50% is a good strike rate. And I think that, as ever with this, there's tons and tons of context, and you know, there's also the way in which the players are used in the football that the manager intends to employ. And you know, I think that we're going to say things that may at times seem obvious, but I think it's worth just sort of restating them. And you know, for instance, on your list here, you've rightly said that Charlie Adam should be a squad player level cheaper signings. It's not how the manager used him. The manager built a midfield around him. And it's
in the end, yeah.
Not even in the end. From day one, he picked him first game of the season, centre mid, gave him the full 90 minutes, and that pattern continued. And it was only when it was only towards the second half of the season, and especially when Adam got injured in March, that he gets out of that side. Apart from that, you know, Steven Gerrard was carrying Charlie Adams' water. He was picked as to come in and run Liverpool's midfield, and we thought that
season was okay till February, funnily enough, though.
But Charlie Adam was absolutely atrocious.
Yeah,
and it's you know, I don't want to sort of bang that drum endlessly, but I will. But my point about this is that, for instance, you know, is also shelf life of footballers. So Enrique, £6 million, does all right. 2 seasons where he does. I mean, trust me, he's nowhere near my all-time Liverpool 11. But he's
solid first.
He's an okay-ish left back. He's not a brilliant left back, but you know, he's okay-ish. You know, Bellamy's on that list as well, and we get basically the last good performance of Craig Bellamy's career that season. You know, the end of Bellamy happens at Liverpool. His legs go.
We get value at £0.
Yeah, we get value at £0. But then again, you know, Downing at 20 million, yeah, overpriced and shouldn't have gone for it. But it's back to sort of what it was that we were looking to achieve. Suarez just fitted what the football Dalglish was playing from 11-12 onwards. But when it becomes sort of when that shifts forward, you know, that's the tough thing. But the one thing I would notice is Downing. By the time Downing signs for us, he's already 25, 26. He hasn't had that move. Charlie Adam isn't in that class. Never in that class, and never had been in that class. It would have been unorthodox if Adam had actually proven himself to be what the way in which we used him, if he'd become that player, it would have been unlikely and unorthodox. Whereas Suarez is of a certain age. Henderson has just turned 20, 21. He's sitting there as well. So it's Downing's the outlier in this one. Downing and Carroll, neither of whom... Carroll hadn't had any opportunity to become proven at a certain level to step up. He'd only done 6 months in the Premier League by the time we lashed 35 million. And Downing, if anything, has had too long playing for Sunderland, playing for Middlesbrough, playing for Aston Villa, and not playing well at times, but never being so irresistible, oh my God, you've just got to have him. Because if that had been the case, someone else would have bought him by that point.
I think...
Sorry, Craig,
just going to say, I think, as Neil said, I think 2011 in a sense is a bit of a case study in terms of like the lack of joined up thinking Liverpool Football Club over the years. If you look at it, there's no clear strategy there in terms of the signings. I mean, you've got players from range of ages, range of abilities, players who are going to suit different systems, different styles of play. So there's clearly no clear strategy throughout the signings that we're seeing that year. And I think that's continued to a sense throughout.
Well, docking. Coming to you on this one. I'll come to you this one. Docking, Neil. What's interesting about it is the two dearest signings, effectively, Carroll and Downing.
That aren't Suarez.
That aren't Suarez, yeah. They're bought... Firstly, I'll make the comment, they're bought to complement each other. One's meant to feed the other. But the other thing is, in judging these signings, and this pattern does repeat itself to a degree, they're bought with a manager and a system in mind, and then a new manager comes in within a year of those boys signing who wants to tear it up and start again.
Yeah.
It's the fact that the football clubs in this state, there's a series of vicious cycles is what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, and I think you can put Adam in that category as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, when Adam came, he had a really good season for Blackpool. His delivery from set pieces looked fantastic, and I think everyone was thinking with him on corners and free kicks.
Like a fat Riyad Mahrez.
with Downing crossing it in, Carroll's going to really flourish. And as Craig just alluded to there, we had this bizarre scenario, I've commented on it before, where Suarez, Dirk, Raul Morales, Maxi Rodriguez had formed a really exciting attacking quartet, in the first half of season that Dalglish had. We were playing some marvellous football. And then he sort of tore up that entire blueprint and went back to an almost early 90s direct sort of target man approach.
It was the Carroll signing, I think, that confused the issue looking back on it.
And it was muddled thinking even in the midst of one manager being in charge, let alone when you then change a manager and get somebody who wants something completely different.
What's interesting about that phase, Neil, is that Atkinson in this case is that actually the manager is working in tandem with the director of football effectively.
Yeah, but there's that. But I think there's something else that we're going to come on and notice, and I'll mark it now, and then we can see it going forward. I like that Neil used the phrase "torn up," that he tore up something and then went in another direction, because I think that the only period where we're going to, broadly speaking, praise the signings is where nothing was torn up, either internally or externally. And I think that that's quite an important thing to note, that we so often talk about, when we talk about the way in which a set of transfers has gone over a period of time, we talk solely about those in and not about those out. So the ins and outs isn't quite the same here for this Dalglish period. But what happened was, as Neil Docking says, Liverpool had a way of playing, an established way of playing, that had done well, if not brilliantly, but where you got the impression everyone knew what the job was. And then it got torn asunder, and suddenly Downing's getting his game, Adam's getting his game. You feel as though there's ways in which they're trying to get... Dalglish never really reconciled what he was doing with Henderson properly, although he got him on the pitch a lot. It was never clear what sort of footballer that he was. And then suddenly, there's the Carroll question there. So all the subtlety in the movements and the cleverness and the building it around Suarez, it does go out the window. It's a decision to tear that up. We're going to come on and talk about, as we move forwards, of when it got torn up externally. But I think, quite consistently, if you look at all this, the most important thing you can actually have when you're buying a set of players, any set of players, is that they come into continuity. And these lads, to be fair to them, even Adam, who I don't rate as a footballer, he doesn't come into continuity because there's deliberate discord and disharmony that's going to happen at Liverpool. It's a decision by the manager to make it happen. And I think as we go through all of them, loads of them are coming into something a little bit chaotic at times. Welcome back, the Anfield Wrap on Radio City Talk. John Gibbons, Gareth Roberts and Damian Hughes in front of me. And we're recording this in the aftermath of England going out to the Euros. We had to make schedules work and all that sort of stuff. So I want to actually pull that in a little bit because there was the comments in the immediate aftermath from both Steven Gerrard and Jamie Carragher about the England players. And I think it can apply to some extent, Damian, to any football. And one of the things that Gerrard spoke about was the idea that when the players were playing for England, but I think, again, it applies to so many different football clubs, and the bigger the club, the more it applies. Talked about fear. Playing on the fear of defeat, the fear of consequences playing on the mind, the emotions taking over rather than just letting processes play out. I mean, it's a criticism you can probably level at Liverpool sides over the last 5 to 10 years. But it's meant to be emotional, and this is the difficult part, isn't it, for a coach of sport? Is meant to be emotional on more than one level. And when you're playing for your country or for a side like Liverpool or Manchester United or whoever, you're representing the hopes and dreams of so many people. So that must be a difficult thing to sort of divorce from a coaching perspective. Yeah,
it is. But I think there's two types of fear. If you think, or there's two types of emotion. There's positive or negative emotion. Now, we're most conditioned to talk in terms of negative fear, like the fear that Steven Gerrard talks about. And all that does is, if that's emphasised and accentuated, all that does is it creates that it causes that narrowing of your focus. You stop being able to see the bigger picture. The freeze, flight, fight response, you either go in your shell, you either become very, very loud and sort of a little bit erratic in your behaviours, or you'll get yourself injured. You look to get out of that situation very quickly. So I think over the years, whenever we played Germany, and it's always been about bringing in the history of 2 World Wars and 1 World Cup and all that nonsense, I just think all that is unhelpful emotion that you need to be. You need to have that passion, that drive, that willingness to fight and do all that. But these players have got all that anyway. That's why they are where they are. So the aim is to keep them nice and calm and focus on the process. Let the fans generate the emotion. The players just need to be nice and calm.
It's interesting in your book you reference the lack of books similar to yours in terms of being about improving leadership that refer to courage. And I think that the emotion and the courage are linked. It's difficult to be courageous if you haven't got the idea of that leap. And that's where I'm intrigued. We mentioned before briefly Jurgen Klopp and managers who embrace emotion to a certain extent, but that's got to constantly be. You can't let that turn inwards, is what you're saying. It's got to constantly be a positive, courageous. This is what we're about, demonstration of the process.
Yeah, so like courage, I mean, if you look at the definition of it, so I think if you ask the layperson, courage is about flying into tackles and like getting a crack on the head and getting up and doing it again. Whereas you speak to a lot of coaches, they say courage to them, real courage is the guy that wants the ball when you're getting beaten, there's 2 minutes left and you're in a tight spot. Yeah. It's the guy that is constantly looking to try something where the risk is that it might not come off. And that's proper courage that you want your players to demonstrate. Not sort of that foolhardy flying into challenges where and risking injury or risking sendings off or something like that. I think that's where Klopp does it brilliantly. I like what he does because I've read a brilliant book by Raphael Honigstein a few years ago that talks about his career at Mainz before he then went on to Dortmund. And this was one of the things that he was, and I think this lies at the key of what he'll do at Liverpool, he drills people in the processes, gets them focused, because he always maintained he could coach the German second division team to get a draw against Bayern Munich with far inferior players, just because he drilled them to such an extent. And I think that's what he's good at doing. He embraces the emotion to get all the positive things out of it, but then gets the players to keep calm and focus on just doing the simple things right.
Is there almost a problem? I don't know if problem's the right word, but in football, but in what you're hinting at there, in what fans want and expect to hear and expect to see, and compared to what players actually need to do and the messages coaches are trying to get across. I mean, I just wrote down there as you were talking that I remember Dr. Steve Peters when he was doing stuff with Liverpool. He did an interview with The Independent, and it was very interesting, but there was a line in it which everyone picked up on in a negative sense from a supporter point of view, in that he talked about that players should only take ownership of things that they can actually control. And what he actually took, but he went further to say, so Liverpool players shouldn't beat themselves up about not winning the league. They should just simply perform the best they can every time. And then if winning the league comes. But if it doesn't, because there's teams better equipped to do that, Liverpool shouldn't then beat themselves up. And that, I thought that was really interesting and made sense. But when it went out there into the wider world in the press, everyone said, well, what's this fella doing at Liverpool? He's talking about not winning the league yet. We want to win it. Why are we employing a fella who's saying to the players, don't worry about not winning the league?
I mean, well, I remember a few years ago, Stuart Pearce, when he was at City, and I remember doing an interview at the time where he said, I take 100% responsibility for all those players and what they do when they're out on the pitch. And I was like, well, that's daft. Because how
have you seen some of your players?
Well, first of all, there's that. But secondly, you go, well, how can you be responsible for what somebody does when they cross the line? So it was a nonsense thing, which can only result in stress and anxiety for him. Now, the Steve Peters one's an interesting one, because what I've done in the book is talk about, you look at any elite cultures that all do well, they all put a huge emphasis on the mental side of the game. So I've used the example, you go to British Cycling, they had Steve Peters working there. You look at the New Zealand All Blacks, they used a guy called Kerry Evans, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, who in 2007, when they got beat in the World Cup, went, we need to do something this because we keep choking under pressure. And they brought this bloke in who and they talk about the 4 key pillars are, you need your physical, your tactical, your technical, and your mental side of the game. All 4 have to be at a level. So you go into any elite culture, you'll find there's a focus on getting these mental skills right. Go into any mediocre culture, they laugh at it, or they do it half-heartedly. So I think, from what I understand, Steve Peters has been working with the England team this time. Now, I can only assume that it's been done as a bit of a public relations thing to say, oh, we are addressing it, rather than we've got any real intent of doing something serious around this. And so I think his point is right, because one of the key points, it's an old phrase from sports psychology, is you control the controllables. When you start focusing on the stuff outside your control, that's where you can lose your head.
Is football still a little bit backwards in this respect then, that it's still a bit macho and it's still a bit, almost I don't want to get involved with things with my mind. I'm this great player. I don't need that. Because, I know with Steve Peters at Liverpool, they made it optional.
It's the same with England.
They made it optional that you could go and see him if you wanted to, and then players then took that choice. And, we were fortunate enough to interview Steve Peters, and obviously, client confidentiality and all the rest of it. He wouldn't go into detail about who it was, but he did say a number of them come to see me. But it wasn't everyone.
Yeah. I'd say it's quite insular. I think a lot of football tends to be quite insular or suspicious of anything different. The easy thing is, well, how many games have you played? How many caps have you got? And it's that idea as if, it's the old Arrigo Sacchi one, isn't it? I don't have to have been a horse to have been a jockey. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And it's always that idea, but it's that idea that anything outside of that world is something to be treated as kid gloves, and therefore to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist, well, that implies as a weakness, rather than you go into, as I say, go into any elite culture. These are not even being addressed as signs of weakness. It's not good or bad. It's just another facet. Like if you wanted to get like muscle fatigue advice, you go and speak to a physio. If you wanted nutrition advice, there's a nutritionist there. If you're lacking a bit of confidence or you need some help in terms of being able to focus during the game, why wouldn't you go and speak to somebody that's got a background in that that can help you do it?
The work that you've done, I just wondered as well, how does it differ when you're dealing with an individual sport to a team sport? Or, would your advice change there? Would you address them together, or would it all be individual work? Or?
Well, a lot of the work I do is more, like, my interest is more about working with the coaches rather than necessarily with the players. And the reason for that is that the coaches are the ones with credibility. Because they pick the team, they decide who gets in, and therefore players will listen to you. So if you can equip the coaches with these skills, that's where I think the impact can be so much greater. In terms of sport individual skills, so if I use boxing versus football, they all have entourages. And I've seen it over the years. One of the biggest frustrations is you get so many good, talented young boxers end up letting themselves down by the choice of the entourage. So they choose people that tell them everything they want to wear. So if they start slacking training, they say, oh, you're all right, you're okay, you'll get by, you're good enough. As soon as they get beat, there's never, have a look at yourself, what did you do? They always go, oh, blame the coach, blame the matchmaker. So I've seen so many good young fighters get let down by choosing their entourage, their team, badly. So I suppose the principles still hold.
It's interesting on that as well, just to throw in an example locally, that the Smith family, You know, they're all, you know, brothers, the dad. And I wonder whether what you've just said is almost the reason why they've all been so successful in that they can all speak to each other very honestly.
They can monitor each other's behaviours. They can make sure that everyone's doing the right thing. They can pass that knowledge along.
But what I mean also is that, like, you know, if Paul spots that Callum's doing something wrong, he can go and say it, and it's not going to upset them. They're not going to fall out because they're family.
Yeah. I mean, I often say that you divide your. I say this to coaches when they're choosing their sort of assistant staff. I always say there's two types. And there isn't, but it just helps bring it into stark contrast.
Simplicity.
I always say, simplicity. Yeah, but I always say, there's time tellers or truth tellers, and you need to get a balance. And what I mean by that is, when you're in sort of a box with coaches and they're under pressure, and they might turn to the other assistants and go, I'm thinking of doing this tactical move. And the time tellers go, well, there's 20 minutes left, boss. And you go, anyone can tell you the time. The clock on the wall does what you've just done. What you want is the guy that'll say, oh, hang on a minute, I don't think that's a good move, or have you tried this, or they'll throw in alternatives just to get you thinking, you know, and you might come back to the same conclusion the coach reached, but at least you force them to do some, some mental gymnastics to get there. And I say that with the boxers that I work with, or any of the athletes. Say, who are you surrounding yourself with? Are you surrounding yourself with truth tellers or time tellers? The ones that'll bull you up, tell you how great you are, but they won't be around when you get beat. They won't hang around for too long. And it's so important just getting them to see it.
One of the things when I heard you talk about a lot of this sort of stuff, you mentioned dealing with, you know, with millionaire young men in the realm of football, and you mentioned that you knew Manchester United did it, which was that it was the idea that there was a white line, and if they crossed the white line, if they crossed over and when they were training, then they were expected to have these sets of behaviours. Before that point, they can be themselves, they can do all this, they can have all this, blah, 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 all the obvious stuff. But as soon as you cross the white line, you agree by that action of stepping over and that this is now what we are these footballers and these are our principles. Is that one of the big challenges you think for managers now, is creating those white lines in the right place and saying, this is where we've become footballers?
I mean, I've heard it in a lot of different ways. Like, there's a lovely way of summarising it. You'll speak to some football coaches that'll say, I've got young lads that like being footballers, they just don't like playing football.
Yeah.
And what they mean by that is they love the lifestyle, the trappings, they love and all that, but coming in and working hard and getting their head down and just developing and training is almost anathema to them. Like, I worked with one lad at a club, and I won't mention his name because he's not fair, but he was a centre forward who'd moved for a lot of money, but he never liked to practice shooting. And speaking to him, he said, why don't you practice it? Because his goal scoring record was abysmal. And his answer was, well, people laugh at me when I miss. And it's like, well, I mean, like, there was more depth to it in terms of what he said, but that was the essence of it. And it was almost like, but he loved the lifestyle. He used to drive a car that you'd see him having to almost come out of it in instalments to get to the training ground. And you go, why are you driving a daft car like that? That can't be good for your posture or anything. Love that, but the idea of staying and grafting or doing any extra training was just anathema to him. So for a lot of coaches, I think the argument is that sort of conditioning or that sort of mindset has to come from within. That comes from your family and your background long before they'll ever get them at that elite level. If they've really not got that passion, but I mean, there are techniques you can use, but it's difficult to put that into somebody. That motivation comes from within. Okay, over to you, Gareth, for the next song. Thanks, Gareth. Back with John, Damian and Gareth, moving forward into having a chat about Guardiola. Your book sort of, it doesn't close with a mini chapter on Guardiola, but it's towards the end of the book where you're discussing storytelling, and you use a story about Guardiola in first game when he gets to Bayern Munich, Super Cup, not first game, but very early on, Super Cup penalty story shootout, where he just, again, this idea of simplicity, he just puts a very direct message into the mind of the players. Yeah, no, Guardiola's a fascinating character in his own regard anyway. I think he's like, I like coaches that are prepared to open the mind to other industries, other aspects. So for him, like his mates with Gary Kasparov, the chess grandmaster, he's a guy that got a real interest in Spanish and Catalan politics, and like when he went out and took his year sabbatical in New York, he was taking himself to university classes for things that interested him. So he's a guy with a wider world view, and I think as a coach that sort of really adds to his appeal. So when he took over, they were playing Chelsea, and it's his first big test at Bayern Munich. Everyone says he's been handed the team on a plate at Barcelona, and everyone's waiting to see what he's about. So the first thing he does is he teaches himself German in his sabbatical, so it takes him 3 months, and by the time he arrives, he's fluent. And then they play Chelsea Super Cup final. It goes to penalties, and Stefan Effenberg says everyone's waiting for him. Like, oh, hang on a minute, let's see what this super coach does. And he gathers all the players round him, and in German, he says, "Listen, lads, come here." He said, "I want to just tell you a quick story." And he said, and all the players were waiting for some kind of Churchillian oratory and whipping him up. And he goes, "Just tell you a dead simple story." He said, "I've never took a penalty in my life." He said, "So I don't know how to take one." He said, "So don't bother listening to me on that regard." He said, "But I've got a lad here that does." And Guardiola's assistant is a guy called Manuel Estiart, who was the world's best water polo player. Nothing to do with football, which again goes back to what I was saying earlier. He's got this willingness to look outside of football for answers. And he says, this guy was the best player in water polo's history. And he went, and he was the best penalty taker. He said, and he told me 2 things about taking a penalty. First of all is, make up your mind where you're going to put it. And then spend the rest of the time just saying to yourself, it's going in, it's going in, it's going in, it's going in. And he said, and you don't say it until it's gone in and you're walking back to the penalty circle. He said, and the players were gobsmacked, like, is that it? And he goes, yeah. He said, anyone who bothers to take one is going to score because you're going to apply those 2 pieces of advice. He said, so just make your mind up who the 5 are and go ahead and do it. Now, all 5 of them, all 5 of the ones that put their hand up, volunteered to do it, went and scored, beat Chelsea in it. And that was the first time where people went, this guy really is something special. And the beauty is, he wasn't doing anything clever, he just went and told them a really simple story about how to take a penalty.
And that's, I mean, you mentioned there, he does this idea where you mentioned the New York thing, and how when he's going and taking other interests in New York, you cited a film director friend of his who says that he's codifying this for football, for his work. So he's out there doing things that we can call in inverted commas normal, going to museums, so on and so forth. But he's constantly thinking, he's drawing this back to football. That's because that's his work and that's what he focuses on.
Yeah. So I mean, so he was there in 2012 when Obama was going for his second run at president, the second term. And his mate, this David Trueba, this film producer, says, he was on the phone all night telling me about speeches Obama had given, and he's watching him and just his ability to engage the audience and how he whips the audience into a frenzy. And he said he was watching it not through some kind of political eyes, but watching it to think, what can I learn from this in that regard? And I've seen it, I mentioned the Ferguson book earlier, but that was one of the things that people spoke to me about, that he seemed to have a stock of about 5 or 6 stories that he'd just wheel out at certain times. So the favourite one that I was told about him was he tells a story when he was a kid walking past a building site with his dad, and he stops the first labourer and he says, what are you doing? And the labourer says, I'm earning £10 an hour or whatever it is. She goes to the next fellow, he says, what are you up to? He says, I'm building a wall. What does it look like? He said, and then they get to the third building and he says to him, what's going on here? And the builder says, I'm building this magnificent cathedral, and one day I'm going to bring my own kids back here and show them what the dad contributed towards. And Ferguson used to use that story, and then he'd say to the players, which builder are you? He said, are you the sort of fellow that's coming in here just to earn £1,000 for your morning's work, or are you going to be the second builder that's coming in to do what you told off the coaches and kick a ball around and do the exercises? Or are you going to be the third builder, the one that's coming to contribute to building the best football club we possibly can, and one day you can look back with your own kids? And the amount of the players I interviewed that told me that story, because it shows you just how powerful it is. Yeah. You know, it's like you go back to, like, you read anything about Shankly or Pace, it's all about stories that they tell, isn't it? It's all stories about, like, getting over a lot of quite deep, complex messages, but telling it in a way that a story just opens your brain up to go, oh, I can receive that in a far more accessible way. And that's what Guardiola does. That's what Ferguson was doing. That's what Shankly was doing. And again, it's success leaves clues. You go to any elite coach in any industry, one of the things you'll find is they're all great storytellers.
So you can go to sports teams, you can go to football clubs, and you can find messages that people can apply to their own work and their own day-to-day life.
100%, yeah. I mean, as I say, success leaves clues, and what the book's been about is trying to find what are those common clues that any of us could take away and use.
And it's also about being alive and being active in the world and being switched on to all this sort of stuff as well, which is always a fabulous thing, and turning it into what you need to function everywhere you go.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lovely story. I sometimes tell it to the athletes that I work with when they turn up and they're a bit sceptical. And I remember reading it years ago where Andrew Luke Oldham, who was the Stones manager, who tells a story when he was in New York at a club with Jimi Hendrix. He said, and they turned up to see this guitarist, and he said, in the first minute, Andrew Oldham says, he was rubbish. He said he was hopeless. He said, it was obvious this fella's no good. And he turned to Jimi Hendrix and he said, come on, he said, get your coat, we'll get going. He he said, this fella's rubbish. He said, and Jimi Hendrix went, no. He said, I'm stopping. And he went, why? What are you stopping to watch him for? He said, he's that bad, he might do something that nobody's ever thought of before. And he said, he'll do it by accident. I can take it and do it on purpose. And I say that point to any of them. I say, there's something to learn in everything if you're prepared to look for it and you come with an open mind. If you come with scepticism, you'll learn nothing. But if you come and looking to see what is the can gain from this, there's plenty of opportunities wherever we look. I've just chosen to use sport as a way to do it.
Do you think being a manager now is any different now, Damian? I mean, those examples that you give, it felt like when Ferguson left, that was almost a huge end of an era, almost in terms of a type of manager. A fella who sticks out a job for tens of years and wins all what he does and is a great name in football. Do you think the job's changed now? I mean, people talk a lot now at teams where, when we're doing shows and writing up and generally taking in everything football. There's a lot of talk now about managers just sort of having maybe like a 3-year cycle, and then after that time their message gets old and they're moved on and you turn to someone else. I think kind of shift somewhere.
Yeah, I think like the average tenure into it of a football manager is 1 year and 4 months before you get the sack. And like the stat that should stand out for all of us with that is that 55% of those who get the sack never get another shot at it again. So in an industry where the patience is so low, the failure rate's so high, but the consequences are massive, I can understand why people sort of go in with that short-term thinking. But what I'd also say is, it goes back to that point that Neil asked about before, that courage. It takes courage to go in and almost step back and see it in a different way. So if you go and attack, so if you go in with a longer term perspective. So one of the things that, say, Ferguson at United, if you like, was the fact that he came in with everything was in 4-year cycles. So whether he was there or not, people could see that he was doing he was making decisions not for necessarily today, but for 4 years' time. And that takes courage to say, I'm not going to go for the short term populist hit. I'm going to try and build something over a sustainable period. I mean, there was a study done in Silicon Valley back in the early 90s that was looking at cultures, and there's 5 types of cultures in any organisation, and it maps to football. You've got your superstar culture, like say City or Real Madrid, where you bring your superstars in, and if it works, it works spectacularly well. But if it goes wrong, it goes spectacularly wrong. You've got like an engineering culture, and I think this is part of what Klopp does at Liverpool. It's that idea of you come in and you get workmen that are prepared to just come and solve problems and deal with things on that thing. You get bureaucracies, which I'd say sounds somewhere a bit like Chelsea, where you get a lot of middle managers trying to muddy the water. You get autocracies, which is I think a bit what Ferguson did, everything went by his rule. Or you get what we call a commitment model, where you say, we're going to get people bought into values and behaviours that are going to be eternal rather than there'll be fads. These are the kind of behaviours that'll be long term. And I think you look at when Liverpool have been successful, you look at any club, those behaviours are pretty much eternal, whether it was Bill Shankly doing it, Bob Paisley doing it. Yeah, when Joe Fagan was there, all of that, those are that commitment model. I don't think that's necessarily changed. I just think it takes courage for somebody to come in and do it, with the pressure that they might not be around to see it through.
We could talk all day. We may well do. Damian Hughes, The 5 Steps to a Winning Mindset. It's a fantastic book. You need to go and get it right now. It's out right now. We've timed this perfectly. You want to get stuck into all that sort of stuff. Huge thank you to Damian, to John, to Gareth Roberts. That's been the Anfield Wrap. It's been a cracker as well.